like, subscribe, and share. Story 1. The Mysterious Date. In my early 20s, life was strange and aimless. Fresh from a breakup with my girlfriend of 2 years and grappling with the death of my grandfather, I felt adrift. To offer my grieving grandmother support and perhaps find some grounding myself, I started attending church with her every Sunday. This was a small town outside Manchester where everybody knew everybody. Church was a tight-knit affair, familiar faces, whispered prayers, and a sense of tradition that felt both comforting and stifling. One Sunday morning, as the choir's voices echoed through the old stone chapel, I noticed someone new. She sat a few pews ahead, her presence striking against the backdrop of familiar congregants. Her dark curly hair caught the light filtering through the stained glass windows, and her hazel eyes seemed to hold secrets. I couldn't take my eyes off her. After the service, I gathered the nerve to approach her. She was standing outside, her coat loosely draped over her shoulders as she gazed at the churchyard. "Hi," I said, trying to sound casual. "I don't think I've seen you around here before." She turned to me, her lips curling into a soft smile. "I just moved here," she replied. Her voice was low, melodic. "I'm Kaylee." Before we parted ways, I asked for her number. She hesitated for a moment, then handed me her phone, letting me enter my own number instead. I couldn't help but wonder what that hesitation meant. That week, Kaylee and I exchanged texts constantly. She was witty and sharp, her humor a mix of dry sarcasm and playful banter. I scrolled through her Instagram, surprised at how few posts she had. There were no pictures of friends or family, just landscapes and abstract shots of books and coffee cups. She was a mystery I couldn't wait to unravel. By the next Sunday, I was eager to see her again. She was there, sitting in the same pew, and after the service, I asked her out. "Dinner and a movie," I suggested. Her smile was warm and immediate. "Sounds perfect." Our date was simple, a casual dinner at a small diner, followed by a movie. Kaylee was an attentive listener, her gaze locked on mine as we talked. Her laughter was soft and genuine, and I felt more at ease with her than I'd felt with anyone in a long time. After the movie, neither of us wanted the night to end. I suggested a drive, thinking the quiet of the road would let us talk more. We left town, the headlights cutting through the darkness as the road twisted and turned. The conversation flowed easily at first, readings, favorite books, random anecdotes. Then, as we drove deeper into the countryside, Kaylee grew quiet. I glanced at her, about to ask if she was okay, when I noticed her eyes. They weren't focused on the road ahead. They seemed to be staring at something far beyond, something I couldn't see. "Kaylee," I said, my voice laced with concern. She didn't respond. Instead, she began to speak, but it wasn't English. Her words were fast and guttural, her voice low and rasping. It sounded like French, but not quite. It was too fragmented, too chaotic. "Kaylee, are you okay?" I asked again, panic creeping into my voice. Her head tilted back, and her eyes rolled upward until only the whites were visible. I swerved the car, narrowly avoiding the barrier, and pulled to the side of the road. My heart was racing, and my hands trembled as I put the car in park. "Kaylee," I shouted, reaching out but stopping short of touching her. Her head vibrated subtly, and her words grew louder, more frantic. I fumbled for my phone, dialing emergency services. "I think my friend is having a seizure," I told the operator, my voice shaking. As I waited for help to arrive, I kept glancing at Kaylee, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, her body went still. She snapped her head toward me, her eyes normal again but wide with terror. Before I could say anything, she threw open the car door and bolted into the woods. "Kaylee," I yelled, but she didn't look back. I sat frozen, the sound of my breathing loud in the silence of the car. The paramedics and police arrived shortly after, finding me still sitting by the roadside, too shaken to move. I told them everything, from Kaylee's trance to her sudden disappearance. They nodded, their expressions a mix of disbelief and concern. They assured me they would search for her, but deep down, I knew she wouldn't be found. In the days that followed, I tried to contact her. Her number was disconnected, her Instagram deleted. I even went back to the church, hoping someone might know her, but no one did. It was as if she had never existed. I moved away a few months later, unable to shake the memory of that night. The thought of her sudden disappearance, the way her voice sounded speaking those strange words haunts me still. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I replay that moment in my mind. I wonder if Kaylee was real or if I had stumbled into something beyond my understanding. I may never know, but one thing is certain, that night changed me forever. Story 2, Desert Nightmare. Driving has always been my escape. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the road, the vast open stretches of highway, it gave me a sense of freedom I couldn't find anywhere else. So, when my friend Kelvin invited me to visit him a few states away, I decided to make it a solo road trip. It would be a chance to reconnect with an old friend and clear my head. Kelvin lived a couple of states over, and the drive to his place was uneventful. I passed through sprawling deserts and isolated towns, the kind of places where time seemed to stand still. Kelvin and I spent a few days catching up, drinking beer, and reminiscing about old times. It was the perfect getaway. But the drive back, that was a different story. I left Kelvin's place early in the afternoon, hoping to make good time and maybe catch a decent night's sleep once I was home. My car, a battered 2012 Volvo, wasn't in the best shape. The brakes were soft, the engine had a mind of its own, and the windshield wipers were completely useless. But it had been reliable enough to get me there, and I figured it could get me back. As I crossed into Nevada, the skies darkened ominously. The forecast hadn't called for rain, but weather in the desert is unpredictable. What started as a light drizzle quickly turned into a torrential downpour, the kind that makes you feel like the sky is falling. The rain hit my windshield like a waterfall, and without functioning wipers, I couldn't see a thing. My heart pounded as I squinted at the road, trying to make up the faint glow of the dividing lines. It was no use. I had to pull over. I veered onto the shoulder of the highway and parked as far off the road as I could. The storm showed no signs of letting up, so I resigned myself to waiting it out. The first hour passed uneventfully. I sat in the car, scrolling through my phone, occasionally glancing out at the storm. The desert stretched out around me, an endless expanse of rock and sand shrouded in rain. It was eerie, but I wasn't scared. Not yet. As the second hour dragged on, an inexplicable sense of unease began to creep over me. It wasn't the storm or the isolation, it was something else, something I couldn't put into words. I found myself glancing out the windows more often, my eyes scanning the darkness for what I didn't know, but the feeling was there, a gnawing tension in the pit of my stomach. Then I saw it, a flash of light in the distance. At first, I thought it was lightning, but it didn't behave like lightning. It was sharp and brief, a flicker of white that seemed to dart across the horizon. Another flash, and another. They were getting closer. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my palms sweating. The flashes grew brighter and more frequent, illuminating the rain-soaked landscape. Then I realized what they were, flashlights. My breath caught in my throat. 3 beams of light were moving through the darkness, zigzagging erratically. They weren't steady or purposeful. They darted and swayed as if the people holding them were stumbling or dancing. I locked the car doors instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. Who the hell was out there in the middle of the desert during a storm? The beams of light drew closer, and soon I could make out three shadowy figures. They were moving toward my car, their flashlights flickering wildly. Panic setting? I didn't know what to do. Should I honk the horn, try to scare them off, drive away blindly into the storm? My hands trembled as I reached for my phone. I dialed 911, whispering into the receiver. "There are people outside my car," I said, my voice barely audible. "They're acting strange. I'm on the side of Highway 50, somewhere near. I don't know. I think I passed Carson City." The operator assured me that help was on the way, but their words felt distant, like they were coming from another world. My focus was locked on the figures outside. The three of them were now circling my car, their flashlights casting erratic beams of light that danced across the rain-slicked windows. They weren't speaking, not to me, not to each other. Then one of them did something that made my blood run cold. They fired a gunshot into the air. The sound shattered the silence, echoing across the desert. I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming, the metallic taste of blood filling my mouth. I crouched low in my seat, trying to make myself as small as possible. The figures continued to circle the car, their movements growing more erratic. One of them banged on the hood, the dull thud reverberating through the vehicle. I didn't dare move. Minutes felt like hours. I clutched my phone, praying that the police would arrive before these strangers did something worse. Suddenly, the lights disappeared. I lifted my head cautiously, peering out the rain-streaked window. The flashlights were gone, the figures nowhere in sight. My heart pounded in my chest, a deafening drumbeat in the silence, and then, just as suddenly as they had vanished, the lights reappeared closer this time, flickering wildly as if taunting me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and bolted from the car, running into the rain. The desert was vast and unforgiving, but I didn't care. I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and those figures. I found shelter behind a large rock formation, crouching low and trying to steady my breathing. The rain soaked through my clothes, but I barely noticed. Peeking out from behind the rock, I could see my car in the distance. The figures had returned, their flashlights casting ghostly beams across the vehicle. One of them leaned against the driver's side door, peering into the car. Another stood a few feet away, their flashlight aimed at the ground. The third was pacing back and forth, their movements erratic and jittery. Finally, I saw it, the faint glow of red and blue lights on the horizon. Relief washed over me as a police cruiser pulled up behind my car, its lights flashing in the darkness. The figures didn't hesitate. As soon as the police arrived, they bolted, disappearing into the rain-soaked desert. The officer stepped out of the car, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I ran toward him, waving my arms frantically. "They were here," I shouted. 3 of them, they were circling my car. One of them had a gun. The officer nodded, his expression calm. "We'll take a look," he said. But by the time he searched the area, there was no trace of the figures, no footprints, no evidence they had ever been there. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the police cruiser, too shaken to drive. The officer waited with me until the storm passed, then followed me to the nearest motel. I never drove through the desert alone again. Even now, years later, the memory of that night haunts me. The flashlights, the gunshot, the way the figures moved, it was like they weren't entirely human. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see those flickering lights, hear the rain pounding against the windshield, and I wonder who or what was out there with me that night. Story 3. The Ghostly Town. It started as a simple road trip. My best friend Carol and I had spent a fun, carefree week in Florida visiting some old college friends, but we both had responsibilities waiting for us back in New Jersey. Instead of flying, we decided to make the long drive back together. The plan was straightforward. Take turns driving, stop only when necessary, and reach home in one straight shot. At first, it was great. The car was packed with snacks, our playlist was blasting, and the road stretched out endlessly ahead of us. The hours melted away as we laughed, sang along to old songs, and caught up on stories we hadn't shared in years. But somewhere along the way, long after the sun had set, things started to change. We'd been driving through the night, and by morning, the hours of sitting still were beginning to take a toll on my back. I shifted in my seat, wincing. "Hey, let's stop at the next town," I said to Carol. "Stretch our legs, maybe grab some food." She agreed, and we kept an eye out for a good place to pull over. A few exits later, we saw signs advertising a touristy little town, local attractions, historic charm, the usual stuff. It seemed like the perfect spot. But as we turned off the highway and drove into town, the first thing I noticed was how empty it was. The streets were eerily quiet, the buildings worn down and faded. It didn't look abandoned, exactly, just off. "You sure this is the right place?" Carol asked, glancing at the cracked signs and peeling paint. I double-checked the GPS. "This is it," I replied, though the unease in my stomach told me we might have made a mistake. We parked in front of a small convenience store, its faded sign barely legible. Stepping out of the car, I felt the strange stillness of the town settle over me like a heavy blanket. Inside the store, things seemed normal enough. The shelves were stocked, the lights flickered slightly but stayed on, and there was even a cashier behind the counter, woman in her mid-30s, with dark brown hair and a friendly, if tired, smile. Carol searched for a specific drink but grew frustrated when she couldn't find it. "This place doesn't have anything decent," she grumbled. I picked up a bottle of Gatorade and headed to the counter to pay. The cashier rung me up without much conversation. She seemed polite, though distant, her gaze flickering to the windows as if she was expecting something. We left and decided to try another convenience store across the street. That's when things started to get strange. The second store was nearly identical to the first, the same layout, the same flickering lights, even the same dusty smell. But what stopped me dead in my tracks was the cashier. It was her, the same woman. Same dark brown hair, same tired smile, same everything. My stomach dropped. "Do you have a twin or something?" I blurted out. The woman frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "No," she said flatly. "I'm an only child." I tried to explain myself, but the words felt ridiculous even as they left my mouth. Carol nudged me. "Come on, let's just go," she muttered, clearly embarrassed by my behavior. Back outside, I turned to Carol. "Tell me you saw it too." That was the same woman. She shook her head, dismissing my panic. "You're probably just tired. Long drives mess with your brain." But I wasn't convinced. I needed proof. I dragged Carol back to the first store, determined to confront the woman and confirm what I'd seen. But when we walked in, the cashier behind the counter was completely different. This woman was older, with short blonde hair and a round face. There was no way anyone could mistake her for the other cashier. I stammered an apology and quickly laughed, my mind racing. "How could this be happening? We need gas," Carol said, breaking the silence. "Let's just fill up and get out of here." I agreed, though every fiber of my being was telling me to leave that town immediately. We pulled into a nearby gas station, a run-down place with faded pumps and a small building in the back. The lot was completely empty, no cars, no people, just us. While Carol wandered inside to look for her elusive drink, I stayed by the car, scanning the horizon. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and the silence was deafening. When Carol returned empty-handed, we decided to leave. But as we walked out of the station, the emptiness we'd seen moments ago had been replaced by chaos. The gas station was now packed. Cars filled every pump, and people were everywhere, milling about as if we'd stumbled into rush hour. It didn't make sense just seconds earlier. The place had been deserted. Even more unsettling, everyone was staring at us, not in a casual, curious way, but in an intense, unblinking way that made my skin crawl. Carol grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Let's go," she whispered, her voice trembling. We climbed into the car and sped away, leaving the eerie stairs and the crowded station behind. Back on the road, the tension in the car was palpable. Neither of us spoke for a while, both too unnerved to process what had just happened. Then, out of nowhere, a minivan passed us. It was an old Toyota Sienna with a spiderweb crack running across the windshield and deep scratches along the passenger side. I noticed it immediately because it looked so beat up, like it had been through hell. Carol made a joke about it, something about how it matched the vibe of the town we'd just left. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. But 10 minutes later, the same minivan passed us again. We both recognized it immediately, the cracked windshield, the scratches. There was no mistaking it. "How is that possible?" Carol asked, her voice rising in panic. "It's the same van." I had no answers. We'd been driving in a straight line at a steady speed. There was no way the van could have turned around and passed us again. The GPS showed that we were making progress, but it felt like we weren't moving at all. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and the landscape outside the windows never seemed to change. Finally, we saw a sign for the interstate. Relief washed over me as we merged onto the highway, leaving the strange town and its inexplicable events behind. By the time we reached home, it felt like waking up from a dream, a disjointed, surreal nightmare that didn't make sense in the daylight. I tried searching online for similar stories, hoping to find some explanation for what we'd experienced. I found accounts of people encountering strange towns, losing time, and witnessing impossible events, but none of it offered any concrete answers. Even now, I can't explain what happened. The town, the cashiers, the gas station, the minivan, it's like we stepped into another reality for a few hours, one that didn't follow the rules of our world. I haven't been on a road trip since.